Hello to everyone at the GLF Africa Digital Conference. Right now, you're joined by over 5,000 people from across Africa and across the globe on this journey to restore and sustainably manage the vast drylands of the continent. In just a few minutes' time, we'll be taking you on a virtual tour of the East African savanna. My name is Tanisha, and I'll be your host for this session. I am a climate, business, and environment journalist based in Johannesburg and currently writing for the Mail and Guardian. So, what do we have in store for you today? Africa's iconic savanna grasslands, enriched by herders, livestock, and wildlife who have coexisted on these lands for thousands of years. After that, we'll hear directly from pastoral herders about some of the challenges and their homelands face as a result of climate change, land degradation, and a lack of tenure and grazing rights. Then we'll talk to scientific experts at the International Livestock Research Institute on how their work is supporting this region's pastoral peoples in overcoming these challenges.
One of the biggest priorities in tackling the restoration of dryland will be to include women in processes that have been traditionally taken on by men.
Data, data, data.
Maintaining and improving soil quality is quite a challenge, but it can be done. And so it's largely through soil and water conservation structures and use of manure and improved forages that feed the livestock that provide that manure. In grasslands, there is generally more carbon below ground than above ground. And so this is a result of the fact that grasses are adapted to especially grazing. And so they tend to have relatively small fraction of their biomass above ground, which is of course what provides forage for livestock and other animals. But most of the biomass that's actually produced in a grassland is produced in the roots. And so of course that's below the soil. Rangelands do store a lot of carbon, and especially in any grassland that has not been plowed and cultivated for agriculture, there is generally a ton of carbon, literally tons of carbon in the soil. And that carbon comes from the root growth of, especially of grasses, but also other vegetation. And that carbon accumulates over millennia of grazing with fertilization from livestock, and it builds up and it builds up. The main goal in a rangeland or a grassland is to keep the carbon in the ground. In rangelands, your number one priority is to maintain the quality of soils that are already there. If those areas are converted to crops, then that is your number one source of degradation in rangelands in terms of soil quality. And so a lot of that carbon will be released to the atmosphere. Those areas will now be more prone to erosion, which not only can release soil carbon, but also the loss of topsoil and nutrients to downslope areas. In rangelands, it's really about managing what's there. The soil quality changes slowly. Because that change is slow, you need communities to manage those rangelands in a way where they are benefiting, and mostly through livestock production, and therefore through that incentive, those communities and those users and residents of the rangeland provide environmental services like carbon storage, keeping that carbon in the ground, preventing erosion, and maintaining a productive ecosystem, which benefits people as well as wildlife, and also provides ecosystem services to people who live downstream.
Kaji dana numeri electroc na ngaramat anyara ngaramat suom ngaramat ntare ngaramat ngarra kada roye nang kabam ko wa ko ra bangata kada banchan oleng ti kwe ko ra tata mo grata enchan tata mo grata enchan pi ngi yol na shamancha na ijo mara kolo kek lo mo grata tana kolo to mi alo to matang ko lo ilo shudal kek.
Pastoralists have lived on this land for nearly 4,000 years. Maasai people respect the Mara, because it provides everything our livestock need.
The world's drylands are exceptional lands that have excited people's imaginations for generations, for good reason. Drylands cover more than 40% of Earth's land surface, more than any other type of land, and are home to most of the Earth's savannas. Known as the savanna continent, Africa has more savannas than on any other continent on Earth. Close to 120 million people, about 2/3 of the rural drylands population across West and East Africa, depend on livestock for their income, nutrition, and way of life. Many of these are pastoralists who herd their cattle, camels, sheep, or goats across the drier parts of these savannas. Their animals feed off the seasonal, patchy vegetation that grow on soils where crop farming is difficult or impossible. In the past, we assumed that most drylands used in common by herders could become overgrazed and degraded. Now we understand that climate has far more impact on these ecosystems than grazing. East Africa, unlike the rest of the world, has a twice-a-year wet and dry season. Because wet seasons can be short and dry seasons long, savanna plants must respond quickly to rainfall, as must the people and wildlife who depend upon them. When a savanna is lush and green, the animals and pastoralists grow rich and fat. When it grows parched and brown the next season, the animals and their people grow lean. The extraordinary productivity of grasslands is manifest by the vast and varied herds of wild animals that have always roamed the plains of East Africa. Natural grasslands generate a vast store of energy derived from the sun, the soil, and water that animals exploit. The hidden secret of these landscapes is that while in forests most of life is found on top of the ground, in African savannas, life teems below ground. Grasses survive by storing starchy food reserves in their underground stems. So even when straw above ground turns dry and yellow, the roots below remain alive, storing starch that stimulates new growth almost immediately when the first rains arrive. Unlike crop farmers, herders and their livestock can move to take advantage of patches of green grass and intermittent water sources to survive dry spells. Did you know that, while a forest appears to have more plant food than a grassland, grassland often has the same amount or more of edible leaf biomass? Dryland pastoralists produce more than half of Africa's red meat and milk. In Kenya, 90% of the meat consumed by the population is supplied by the 16 million dryland livestock herders in the country. Most of these herders inhabit arid and semi-arid lands that cover most of Kenya and sustain both wildlife and livestock. Savanna grasslands are not fragile lands. They are built to survive periodic drought and flooding, grazing and burning. And because they are naturally resilient, drylands that do become degraded can return to health with appropriate land use. Africa is remarkable, not because there are many types of mammals, but because they are so big. No other place in the world supports the diversity of large mammals that live in Africa today. In East Africa, people and wildlife co-evolved together. An African conservation ethic for pastoral savannas is one that promotes conservation with development and development with conservation. Did you know that Tanzania has more land in protected areas than any country in the Western world, and the national government of Kenya spends more on protected areas per square kilometre than the United States does. In Kenya, about half the nation's wildlife still live outside wildlife preserves on pastoral lands. Where pastoralists share fairly in the profits stemming from wildlife conservation, conflicts between people and wildlife can be turned back into coexistence, but when farms cover a major part of a savanna, most wildlife disappear. New and accelerating political, economic, and climatic stresses are challenging pastoral resilience and ability to adapt. Changing land tenure arrangements, ad hoc land use policies, and increasing human population and agricultural demands are driving people onto formerly open rangelands. Human settlements in these areas are disrupting the traditional routes of mobile herders, livestock, and wildlife. Further exacerbating this challenge is the increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events due to climate change. In response to these changes, pastoralists are creating new ways to manage rangelands. Community-based rangeland management is one of the most promising means of achieving socially just, economically viable, and environmentally sustainable management of rangelands. Did you know, in Kenya, pastoralists are creating institutions such as conservancies and grazing associations to unify fragmented drylands? Today, the Kenya Wildlife Service and local county councils and the Tanzanian National Parks Authority all share some of the proceeds from tourist fees with local pastoral communities. A novel, index-based drought insurance for dryland livestock keepers has been piloted and scaled up successfully in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. A more resilient and stable drylands livestock economy is achievable. Some 30 years ago, saving the last rainforest from the axe of development caught the imagination of the world. As our understanding grew, so did our commitment to protect the indigenous peoples as well as biodiversity of the rainforests. The great savanna lands of Eastern Africa, cradle of humankind, home to traditional nomadic pastoralists and the last refuge of some of the most spectacular wildlife populations on Earth, should draw similar levels and kinds of global commitment.
Entiakita duo ekenyua ekenyiki yiok kiserian entoiki olari omunyak inkishu ang teneoshi ming'atai intimi entoosh ena wenkae ori.
So that was a look into some of the myths and misconceptions around drylands. We learned that rather than being marginal and fragile, drylands are actually incredibly productive and resilient. Let us know in the chat what you thought about this film, what you learned, and what you found interesting or surprising. Next up, let's hear from our panel of experts on dryland restoration and management opportunities. First, it's my pleasure to introduce three experts from ILRI. Fiona Flintan is a scientist specializing in rangeland and pastoral issues. She will talk about recent efforts to compile data on the world's rangelands to guide international organizations, NGOs, and policymakers in identifying opportunities to better manage drylands that are undergoing rapid changes. Fiona will also tell us about the first ever global rangelands atlas, which was launched by the world's leading environmental organization earlier this week. We also have Jason Sircely, an ecosystem ecologist, who will talk about the extraordinary biodiversity of dryland ecosystems. This includes not only large wild and domesticated animals, but also the teeming life hidden below the surface of Africa's savannas, in the roots of the grasses and the soils that support them. Last but not least, Renee Bullock is a gender and environment scientist who will then talk about climate change and other challenges. Pick up. We will also hear voices from the field from the people who depend directly on the health of East Africa's drylands for their livelihoods. We will also hear from Mary Litorock, a Samba or pastoralist who raises goats and sheep in northern Kenya, who will talk about the challenges she faces from climate change, increasing droughts and deforestation. Our final guest is Nixon Ole Pamisa, a Maasai livestock pastoralist and honorary wildlife warden in the Kitengela rangelands of Kenya. He helped lead a participatory mapping project of those rangelands, and he will explain how data collection is supporting rangeland management at the local, regional, and global levels.
One of the biggest priorities in tackling the restoration of dryland will be to include women in processes that have been traditionally taken on by men.
Data, data, data.
Maintaining and improving soil quality is quite a challenge, but it can be done. And so it's largely through soil and water conservation structures and use of manure and improved forages that feed the livestock that provide that manure. In grasslands, there is generally more carbon below ground than above ground. And so this is a result of the fact that grasses are adapted to especially grazing. And so they tend to have relatively small fraction of their biomass above ground, which is of course what provides forage for livestock and other animals. But most of the biomass that's actually produced in a grassland is produced in the roots. And so of course that's below the soil. Rangelands do store a lot of carbon, and especially in any grassland that has not been plowed and cultivated for agriculture, there is generally a ton of carbon, literally tons of carbon in the soil. And that carbon comes from the root growth of, especially of grasses, but also other vegetation. And that carbon accumulates over millennia of grazing with fertilization from livestock, and it builds up and it builds up. The main goal in a rangeland or a grassland is to keep the carbon in the ground. In rangelands, your number one priority is to maintain the quality of soils that are already there. If those areas are converted to crops, then that is your number one source of degradation in rangelands in terms of soil quality. And so a lot of that carbon will be released to the atmosphere. Those areas will now be more prone to erosion, which not only can release soil carbon, but also the loss of topsoil and nutrients to downslope areas. In rangelands, it's really about managing what's there. The soil quality changes slowly. Because that change is slow, you need communities to manage those rangelands in a way where they are benefiting, and mostly through livestock production, and therefore through that incentive, those communities and those users and residents of the rangeland provide environmental services like carbon storage, keeping that carbon in the ground, preventing erosion, and maintaining a productive ecosystem, which benefits people as well as wildlife, and also provides ecosystem services to people who live downstream.
Kaji nanu Mary Litorock na ngaramata nyara, naramat suam, naramat ntare, naramat ngerra. Kata roye nangko pam kogwa kora bangata kata banchan oleng ti kwe kora tata mokarata enchan pi nkiyiolo neshomo nchan naa ijo mara kulo keek lomokure eetae tanaa kulo tomia lootumuta enkop loishutua irkeek naa mokure apa eetae nchan kou taata keibelekenye enkop kuliko enapa kata. Keetae naa duake nkujit nkata enchan hoo naa nkata nemeetae nchan naji naa etii nkujit naa kore nkata apake naatae nchan nkata naatae nchan nesupatu irkeek nejing ntokitin pookin nejing sagaram nenya swam. Kore nkata nemeetae nchan netoyu kila kitu naa keong ake kila ng'oji. Keyieu naa duake kore naa mabadiliko nouni naa irkeek toonkumoi peemetoki naa nchan aimin.
In dryland settings, where there's more of a patriarchal culture and sets of social norms that determine what women and men can or shouldn't do, it's obvious that women still rely upon land resources for a lot of the activities that they're responsible for carrying out. For example, women might use land for water, for harvesting firewood, for even grazing their own cattle. So their access to land is important and needs to be protected and supported. Women's engagement and especially leadership, assuming leadership positions in conservancy committees has been really important, not only in getting women into conservancies where some of their gender specific needs are met, but it's also very important for supporting women's leadership in communities. It's a transformative kind of process to get women into positions where they're making decisions about how to manage particular lands. And it's also important to have a more socially inclusive approach towards natural resource management. So marginalizing anyone from access can have some dangerous implications for sustainable development and for more equitable access to resources, which in certain communities is very much limited. Some of the drylands areas are already very marginalized, so further marginalizing an individual's access to that land because of their gender, their age, their ethnicity is really harmful for particular groups in society. So it will be a big priority to kind of address some of these social inequalities and engage women in processes of managing land to support more socially inclusive land management, and especially in the restoration.
I'm Nixon Parmisa and the Assistant Chief of this particular area. So a few years ago, the local community together with the International Livestock Research Institute came up with an idea to do a mapping outside the Kitengela dispersal area to establish the area that has been taken by fences. This is in line with conservation and livestock keeping. We decided to come up with a land use plan for Kitengela. And the idea was to zone all the town areas, try to stop the mushrooming of small town within the dispersal area, and be able to create a space for livestock and wildlife. So for now, the results of that mapping that was done and adopted by the county government now has really helped us to come up with a conservancy outside Nairobi National Park.
I think there hasn't been so much data collected on rangelands and drylands because these areas have always seemed to be marginal lands by sight. When we look at rangelands visually, we don't see so much there in front of us than if we look at a forest or if we look at croplands, for example. A lot of the bounty of rangelands, a lot of the productivity, the biodiversity is hidden. And as a result, they've received less attention than other ecosystems. We started thinking about these data gaps when we were trying to put together articles on rangelands. And we wanted to have some clear facts and figures to use. But when we started looking at the figures that people were using on rangelands, and for example, the spatial distribution of rangelands around the world, some people were quoting 20%, others were quoting 80%, and somewhere in the middle was 40 to 50%. And we started digging a bit deeper and going backwards to look for the actual sources of the data that was being used often. And what we found was that really the primary source of many of these figures that had been tweaked and represented in different ways, and often badly represented, were studies done by FAO in the 1960s. And that was really the last time that there was any comprehensive consolidation of data on rangelands. We felt it was really important to start filling some of these data gaps, because we can't lobby for protection of rangelands unless we show their value. We can't talk about investments in rangelands if we don't know where those investments are most appropriate. We can't talk about restoring rangelands unless we know where the places that we need to start, where the opportunities are for restoration. And for all of this, we need data. This was the main drive for us to start putting data sets together at the global level to give some picture of spatial distribution of rangelands and the changes taking place. One of the things we have done as ILRI and with our partners is produce an atlas on rangelands. The atlas is a very good starting point for talking about drylands and the important role that drylands play in the world as an ecosystem that provides habitats for wildlife and for extensive livestock production. Our next steps going forward after the launch of the Global Rangelands Atlas is to start raising awareness on rangelands and their productivity, their value, but also then see how we can work with other actors to really start identifying those areas where investment is needed, including restoration. I mention this particularly because this week, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration will be launched. So for us, the Atlas is a very important starting point for discussions on this going forward.
So that's it for this virtual tour of East Africa's savannas, an extraordinary land home to nomadic pastoral communities and some of the most spectacular wildlife on the planet. We heard from some of these local pastoralists themselves and from a team of leading rangeland experts from the ILRI who provided some incredible insights into some of the challenges facing the region, including climate and land use change, as well as ways we can help pastoral communities adapt and continue to steward these landscapes for generations to come. Thank you all for joining us. Let us know your thoughts in the chat and stay tuned for more exciting and thought-provoking sessions throughout the rest of the day. Bye for now.